A millionaire sees a homeless girl that looks exactly like his dead daughter, but then he sees her necklace. It's the same heart-shaped pendant he buried beneath her memorial tree. Frozen in shock, he races back to find her, but she's gone. Now haunted by the impossible, he begins a desperate search. Could the daughter he lost still be alive? And if so, why doesn't she remember him? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Carlos Rivera opened his eyes to the same emptiness that greeted him every morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of his master bedroom, illuminating the pristine white sheets and polished marble floors of his mansion. Everything was in perfect order, just as he required it to be, just as empty as his heart had been for the past 5 years. He sat up slowly, his movements mechanical. At 52, Carlos still cut an impressive figure, salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed, his face handsome despite the permanent creases of sorrow etched around his eyes. The house around him was worth millions, but to Carlos it felt like nothing more than an elaborate tomb. "Good morning, Mr. Rivera," Elena called softly from the hallway. "Your coffee is ready downstairs." Elena had been with the family for over 20 years. She was the only person he'd kept around after the accident. Not out of sentiment, he told himself, but because she knew how to maintain the precise order he needed to function. "Thank you, Elena," he replied, his voice flat. Downstairs, Carlos moved through his morning routine with practiced precision. The kitchen gleamed with unused appliances and spotless countertops. His breakfast, 2 eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, waited at the exact spot it always did. As he ate, his eyes drifted to the glass cabinet in the dining room. Behind its locked doors sat a collection of framed photographs, preserved like museum pieces. A beautiful dark-haired woman laughing at the camera, a little girl with her mother's smile and his own determined eyes, his wife Maria, his daughter Emilia, both gone now, taken in a boating accident that he should have been present for. Carlos looked away. 5 years and still the pain felt fresh. His phone buzzed with a message. Benjamin Cortez, his estate lawyer and once close friend. "Annual Children's Hospital Gala tonight. Table reserved for you as always. Time to rejoin the world, old friend." Carlos deleted the message without replying. Later, when Benjamin called, he answered with cold efficiency. "Carlos, it's been 5 years," Benjamin said, his voice gentle but insistent. "The foundation does good work. Work Maria would have supported." "Those events are for people who still have someone to save," Carlos replied, his voice tight. "My someone is gone." "Carlos, I have a meeting. Goodbye, Benjamin." The rest of Carlos's day passed in a blur of spreadsheets and financial reports. Rivera Enterprises continued to thrive under his leadership, even as its CEO moved through life like a ghost. As the sun began to set, Carlos did the one thing that broke his routine. He walked through the manicured gardens to the far corner, where a young maple tree grew. Beneath it stood a small headstone, though no bodies had ever been recovered from the lake. Carlos knelt before it, his fingers tracing the engraved names. Hanging from a small hook on the stone was a heart-shaped pendant, a replica of the one he'd given Emilia on her 5th birthday. The original was lost with her at the bottom of Lake Michigan. "I'm still here," he whispered, the words catching in his throat, "even if I don't know why anymore." The pendant caught the fading sunlight, gleaming gold against the gray stone. For a moment, Carlos allowed himself to remember his daughter's laughter when she'd first opened the gift, how she'd worn it every day after. Then, like always, he locked the memory away, rose to his feet, and walked back to his beautiful, empty house. The next day, Carlos found himself in the city for the first time in months. The quarterly board meeting had run longer than expected, leaving him downtown as dusk settled over the buildings. Normally, his driver would have been waiting, but Carlos had dismissed the man earlier, suddenly craving solitude and a rare moment outside his carefully controlled environment. "I'll walk," he had told his surprised assistant. "The fresh air will do me good." Now, as the streetlights flickered on and shadows lengthened across the sidewalks, Carlos walked the 6 blocks to where he'd parked his rarely used Mercedes. The city hummed around him, people hurrying home from work, Street vendors closing their carts, the constant symphony of horns and voices that made up urban life. Carlos noticed none of it. His mind remained on spreadsheets and profit margins, safe territory that required no emotional investment. He reached his car and slid into the leather driver's seat, feeling oddly disconnected from the world outside his window. At the first red light, Carlos drummed his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. He'd forgotten how much he disliked city traffic. The light seemed determined to stay red forever. Exhaling slowly, he glanced out the passenger window. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled against a trash bin beneath a flickering street lamp. A child. A girl no more than 10 or 11, with tangled dark hair and clothes too thin for the October chill. Her small shoulders shook with each breath, arms wrapped tightly around knees pulled to her chest. Something about her posture, the vulnerability of her small form against the harsh urban backdrop, made Carlos look twice. In that second glance, his heart stopped. Around the girl's neck hung a pendant, a heart-shaped pendant that caught the streetlight and glinted gold against her dirty sweater. Carlos's breath caught in his throat. The pendant was identical to Emilia's, the unique heart with its tiny ruby center that he'd had custom-made for his daughter's 5th birthday. The same design as the replica that hung on her memorial stone. "Impossible," he whispered, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. A horn blared behind him. The light had turned green. Carlos pulled forward automatically, his mind racing. It couldn't be the same necklace. It couldn't be. Emilia's necklace lay at the bottom of Lake Michigan, lost with her and Maria when the boat capsized. Yet the image of the pendant burned in his mind. He had to know. Carlos pulled over at the first opportunity, barely remembering to put the car in park before he was out the door. He ran back toward the intersection, dodging startled pedestrians, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Excuse me," he muttered, pushing past a couple on the sidewalk. "Sorry." When he reached the street lamp, he stopped abruptly. The trash bin stood empty against the wall. The girl was gone. Carlos spun in a circle, scanning the faces in the thinning crowd. "Did you see a little girl?" he asked a passing woman. "Just now? Right here?" The woman quickened her pace, avoiding eye contact with the wild-eyed man. Carlos stood alone under the street lamp, breathing hard. For the first time in 5 years, something had pierced the careful numbness he'd constructed around himself. Something that looked exactly like his daughter's necklace, worn by a child the age Emilia would be now. The next morning, Carlos woke before dawn. He hadn't slept more than an hour or two, his mind racing with possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. He showered and dressed quickly, choosing casual clothes instead of his usual tailored suit. "Elena," he called to his housekeeper as he headed toward the door. "I'll be out for the day. Don't prepare lunch." Elena appeared from the kitchen, surprise evident on her face. "But sir, it's Tuesday. You never leave on Tuesdays." "Today I do," Carlos replied simply, already halfway out the door. He stopped at a cafe first, buying a dozen sandwiches and pastries. Next came a department store where he purchased children's coats in various sizes, along with gloves, scarves, and warm socks. The cashier smiled at him. "Your kids will love these," she said cheerfully. Carlos nodded without correcting her and hurried back to his car. By 9 o'clock, he was back at the corner where he'd seen the girl. The morning crowd bustled past, office workers clutching coffee cups, delivery drivers unloading vans, students with backpacks. But no children, no girl with a heart-shaped pendant. Carlos settled onto a bench across from the trash bin and waited. An hour passed, then another. Occasionally, he would approach someone who looked homeless, offering food and asking questions. "I'm looking for a girl," he'd say, showing a photo of the pendant on his phone. "About 10 years old. She wears a necklace like this." Most people shook their heads. Some took the food with mumbled thanks. A few eyed him suspiciously and walked away. Around noon, a group of 3 children appeared, hovering near a dumpster behind a restaurant. Carlos approached slowly, holding out sandwiches. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I just want to ask about someone." A boy, perhaps 12, stepped forward cautiously. "What do you want, mister?" "I'm looking for a girl," Carlos said, handing over the food. About your age, dark hair. She wears a heart necklace. The children exchanged glances. You mean Clara? The boy asked, unwrapping his sandwich. Carlos's heart jumped. Clara, is that her name? Maybe, the boy said, suddenly wary. Why you looking for her? I just want to talk to her about her necklace. Carlos handed out the remaining food and a coat to each child. If you see her, could you give her this? He placed a wrapped sandwich on the bench with a handwritten note tucked under it. As Carlos stepped back, he felt eyes on him. Turning slowly, he spotted her, the girl from yesterday, watching from the shadow of a doorway across the street. Clara. She was thinner in daylight, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes even more ragged than he'd first thought. But the pendant still hung around her neck, catching the sunlight. Carlos raised his hand in a small wave, afraid any sudden movement might scare her away. Clara didn't wave back, but she didn't run either. Her dark eyes remained fixed on him, calculating, assessing. He pointed to the bench where he'd left the sandwich and note. Clara's gaze followed his gesture. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with the darting quickness of a sparrow, Clara crossed the street. She snatched the sandwich from the bench, the note falling to the ground in her haste. She paused, looked back at Carlos, then bent to pick up the note as well. Before Carlos could approach, she was gone, disappearing into an alley between buildings. That night, Carlos sat in his study surrounded by photo albums he hadn't opened in years. Pictures of Amelia smiled up at him. Amelia blowing out birthday candles, Amelia at the beach, Amelia in her mother's arms. In every photo where her neck was visible, the heart pendant rested against her skin. Carlos studied the images closely, using a magnifying glass to examine the details of the necklace. In one photo taken at her 5th birthday party, Amelia's hair was pulled back in a ponytail, revealing a small crescent-shaped scar just behind her right ear. Carlos touched the photo gently, remembering the day she'd gotten that scar, falling from a swing set when she was 3. Could it really be you? He whispered to the photograph. After all this time. Earlier that day, Elena moved quietly around the kitchen, watching Carlos with worried eyes. He sat at the breakfast table, fork hovering over his untouched eggs, gaze fixed on something beyond the window. The newspaper beside his plate remained folded and unread. Is everything all right, Mr. Rivera? Elena asked, refilling his coffee cup. Carlos blinked, seeming to notice her for the first time that morning. Yes, fine, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena had worked for Carlos for 15 years, long enough to read the subtle shifts in his mood. This wasn't his usual sadness. This was something else. A restless energy she hadn't seen in him since before the accident. You've barely touched your breakfast, she said gently. Carlos pushed the plate away. I'm not hungry. He stood abruptly. I'll be in my office. Benjamin is coming by at 10. Elena nodded, concern etched on her face as she watched him leave. In his office, Carlos paced. He'd called Benjamin first thing that morning, asking him to come by, something he never did. When the doorbell rang, Carlos nearly jumped. Benjamin Cortez entered the office with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. Tall and silver-haired, he carried his briefcase more out of habit than necessity. This is a surprise, Benjamin said, settling into the leather chair across from Carlos's desk. 2 conversations in 2 days? People will talk. Carlos didn't smile at the joke. I need to show you something. He pushed a sketch pad across the desk. On it was a careful drawing of a girl's face. Thin, solemn, with large eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Who is this? Benjamin asked. A girl I saw downtown. She was homeless, Ben. Carlos's voice tightened. And she was wearing Amelia's necklace. Benjamin's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Carlos, I know what you're thinking, Carlos interrupted, but it's identical. The exact same pendant. Those necklaces aren't one of a kind, Benjamin said carefully. And even if it were similar, it's not just the necklace, Carlos insisted. There's something about her. Her age would be right. And I think I saw a scar behind her ear just like Amelia's. Benjamin set the sketch down with a sigh. "Carlos, we've been here before." The words hung heavy between them. 3 years after the accident, Carlos had become convinced he'd spotted Emilia in a crowd at the mall. He'd spent months and thousands of dollars on private investigators, only to discover the girl was someone else's daughter. The disappointment had sent him spiraling into a breakdown that had required hospitalization. "This is different," Carlos said quietly. "That's what you said last time." Benjamin leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "It nearly destroyed you, Carlos. The doctor said another episode like that could—" "I'm not having an episode." Carlos's fist came down on the desk. "I'm not imagining things." Benjamin raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying you are. I'm just asking you to be careful, to consider all possibilities." Carlos stood and walked to the window. "I've spent 7 years being careful, 7 years accepting that they're gone." He turned back to face his friend. "What if I was wrong?" After Benjamin left, Carlos spent hours at his computer, searching public records and contacting homeless outreach programs. He called shelters and community centers, describing Clara and her necklace. Most were polite but unhelpful. A few promised to keep an eye out. As evening approached, Carlos filled a thermos with hot chocolate and wrote a note on a small card. "Please trust me." He returned to the bench where he'd left the sandwich, placing the thermos and note carefully on the wooden slats. Then he retreated to his car, parked just far enough away to watch without being obvious. The temperature dropped as darkness fell. Carlos turned on the car's heater, but kept his eyes fixed on the bench. Just after 9, a small figure emerged from the shadows. Clara approached the bench cautiously, looking in all directions before reaching for the thermos. She read the note, tucking it into her pocket before unscrewing the cap. Steam rose into the cold night air as she took a tentative sip. For just a moment, a smile flickered across her face, small but real. She sat on the bench, cradling the warm container in both hands, and Carlos felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. That night, Carlos couldn't sleep. The image of Clara sipping from the thermos kept replaying in his mind. He tossed and turned until finally giving up around 3 in the morning. In his study, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he rarely touched, and pulled out a worn leather photo album. The pictures inside told the story of a different life. Carlos smiling with his arm around a beautiful woman, both of them holding a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Emilia's first steps, her 5th birthday party, family vacations at the beach. Carlos's fingers trembled as he turned to the last photos they'd taken together. Emilia at 10, her dark hair blowing in the wind as she stood proudly on the deck of their new sailboat. The Rivera Explorer, she'd named it, already dreaming of adventures they would have. His mind drifted back to that day 5 years ago. The weather had been perfect when they set out. Clear blue skies, gentle breeze. Just a father and daughter day on the water while his wife, Maria, visited her sister on the mainland. "Can we go a little farther out, Papa?" Emilia had asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Just a little," he'd agreed. The storm had appeared out of nowhere. One moment they were laughing, the next fighting for their lives as waves crashed over the deck. The memory came in terrible flashes, the boat tipping, Emilia's scream, his desperate lunge to grab her hand. "Emilia!" His voice had been swallowed by the howling wind. The last thing he remembered was the sight of her red life jacket disappearing beneath a massive wave before something struck his head. When he awoke in the hospital 2 days later, Maria was sitting beside his bed, her face hollow with grief. "They found the boat," she'd whispered. "But not—" Her voice had broken. For weeks, search teams combed the waters. They found fragments of the boat, Emilia's shredded life jacket, but no body. Hope faded with each passing day. 6 months later, Maria was gone too. A sudden heart attack, though Carlos knew it was really a broken heart that took her. The doctors called it stress cardiomyopathy. Carlos called it the final blow. After that, he'd withdrawn completely. Family gatherings became unbearable. Friends' attempts at comfort felt like sandpaper on raw skin. One by one, He cut ties with everyone except Benjamin, who handled his legal affairs, and Elena, who refused to leave despite his best efforts to push her away. Now, sitting in his study with the photos spread before him, Carlos wondered if he was setting himself up for another devastating disappointment. What were the chances that this homeless girl was somehow connected to Amelia? And yet that necklace. The next evening, Carlos returned to the bench with another thermos of hot chocolate and a paper bag containing a sandwich and an apple. This time, he didn't hide in his car. He sat on the bench and waited. Nearly an hour passed before Clara appeared, stopping abruptly when she saw him. "It's okay," Carlos said softly. "I just want to talk." She took a few hesitant steps forward, her eyes darting around as if mapping escape routes. "I brought more hot chocolate," he said, holding up the thermos, "and some food if you're hungry." Slowly, she approached and perched on the far end of the bench. Carlos set the food between them, giving her space. "My name is Carlos," he said. She didn't respond, but she reached for the thermos. "That's a beautiful necklace you have," Carlos said, his voice carefully steady despite the pounding of his heart. Her hand went to the pendant automatically, closing around it like a talisman. "You remind me of someone," he continued gently. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were dark and serious, filled with a wariness that no child should know. "I don't know who I am," she said finally, her voice small but clear. The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. He had to grip the bench to steady himself. "What do you mean?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice calm. Clara looked down at her worn shoes. "I don't remember anything from before I was 6. The social workers said I was found on a beach. No one knew my name." Carlos sat in silence for a long moment, his mind racing with possibilities. The girl's words echoed in his head. "I don't remember anything from before I was 6. "Are you hungry?" he finally asked, his voice gentle. "I have a warm house, food. You could take a shower, get some clean clothes." Clara's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because..." Carlos paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because no one should be alone in the cold, just for a meal and warmth. Then if you want to leave, I'll bring you back." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Just for tonight," she whispered. The drive home was quiet. Clara stared out the window, clutching her backpack tightly against her chest. When they pulled up to the iron gates of the Rivera estate, her eyes widened. "You live here?" she asked. Carlos nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his wealth. "It's just a house." Elena was waiting at the door when they arrived. Her eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Clara, but her warm smile never faltered. "Welcome," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Elena." Clara didn't take the offered hand, but she mumbled a quiet hello. "Are you hungry, dear?" Elena asked. "I can make you something to eat while Carlos shows you where you can clean up." "I made up the guest room," Carlos said, shooting Elena a grateful look. She had always been able to read his mind. After a simple dinner of soup and bread, which Clara devoured hungrily, Elena brought out a small stack of folded clothes. "These might be a bit big, but they're clean," she said kindly. "The bathroom has fresh towels and everything you'll need." Clara looked overwhelmed by the kindness, but she took the clothes with a whispered, "Thank you." Later, after she had showered and changed, Clara curled up on the guest bed and fell asleep almost instantly. Carlos stood in the doorway, watching her peaceful face. The years of hardship seemed to melt away in sleep, revealing the child she truly was. Quietly, he pulled an old photograph from his pocket, Emilia at 10 years old, laughing at the camera. He held it up, comparing the sleeping girl to the image of his daughter. The resemblance was undeniable. By morning, Carlos had made his decision. After ensuring Clara was comfortable with Elena, he drove to his office downtown. His first call was to Lucas Delgado, a private investigator he had used for business matters in the past. "I need your help with something personal," Carlos said when Lucas answered. "I need to find out everything about a girl's past." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Carlos sipped his coffee, watching Clara cautiously explore the house. Elena had made pancakes, and the girl ate them slowly, savoring each bite as if afraid it might be her last good meal. "Would you like to see the garden?" Carlos asked, surprising himself with the invitation. He hadn't shown anyone the garden in years. Clara nodded, following him through the French doors that led to the sprawling backyard. The garden was beautiful, but showed signs of neglect in certain corners, places Carlos couldn't bring himself to tend. As they walked, Carlos's mind drifted to another time, a time filled with laughter and joy. "My daughter and I used to spend hours out here," he said softly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "We would build castles out of sticks and stones. She had such an imagination." In his mind's eye, he could see Amelia, her dark hair bouncing as she arranged pebbles around a stick fortress. Her laughter echoed in his memory. "Daddy, if I ever get lost, I'll follow my heart home," she had told him once, pointing to the heart-shaped pendant around her neck. "It's like a compass that always points to you." Carlos had hugged her tightly. "And my heart will always lead me to you, princess." His throat tightened at the memory. Clara wandered ahead, curious and quiet. She stopped suddenly near a flowering shrub and knelt down. With gentle fingers, she brushed away fallen leaves, revealing the weathered remains of a tiny structure, sticks arranged in a square with pebbles forming a path. "Did someone live here?" she asked innocently, looking up at Carlos. He stood frozen, staring at the forgotten castle he and Amelia had built the week before the accident. He'd forgotten it was there, hidden beneath the overgrown shrub. "Yes," Carlos replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone very special." That evening after dinner, Clara sat by the window in the living room, gazing at the darkening garden. Without seeming to realize it, she began to hum softly, a gentle, haunting melody that floated through the quiet house. In the kitchen, Elena dropped a plate. The crash made Carlos look up from his newspaper. "Elena, are you all right?" The housekeeper stood motionless, her face pale as she stared toward the living room where Clara sat. "That song," Elena whispered. "Mr. Rivera, that's the lullaby Amelia used to sing. The one her mother taught her." Carlos felt the blood drain from his face. He rose slowly from his chair and moved to the doorway, listening. The simple melody continued, Clara's soft humming filling the room with a tune he hadn't heard in 5 years, a tune only Amelia had known. The following afternoon, Carlos sat alone in his study, a weathered photo album open on his desk. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through the tall windows as his fingers carefully turned brittle pages. Each photograph was a preserved moment from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. He paused at a particular page, his breath catching. Summer, 1965. The Rivera family vacation to Playa del Carmen. The photograph showed a younger Carlos, his arm wrapped around his wife Maria's shoulders. They stood on golden sand, waves lapping at their ankles. Between them, a small girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile held their hands, her face tilted toward the sun. Around her neck hung the heart-shaped pendant catching the light. Carlos traced his finger over Amelia's face in the photo. "Where did you go?" he whispered. The sound of the doorbell pulled him from his thoughts. He closed the album gently and went to answer it. Lucas Delgado stood on the doorstep, his weathered leather briefcase in hand. The private investigator's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that made Carlos's stomach tighten. "Mr. Rivera," Lucas said with a nod, "I have some information." Carlos led him to the study where Lucas opened his briefcase and laid out several folders. "I've been searching every database I can access," Lucas began, his voice measured and professional. "School records, foster care systems, hospital admissions. What I've found, or rather, what I haven't found, is concerning." He opened the top folder, revealing printouts of database searches and official documents. Clara, as she calls herself, doesn't seem to exist in any system before 5 years ago. No birth certificate, no school enrollment, nothing. Carlos leaned forward. That's impossible. Every child has records. Lucas nodded grimly. Exactly. It's as if she appeared out of nowhere. The first record I could find was an admission to St. Mary's Hospital in Port Angeles, dated almost exactly 5 years ago, 3 months after your boating accident. Carlos felt his heart hammering against his ribs. What happened? According to the report, she was brought in by an unidentified male who claimed to have found her wandering near the harbor. She was suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and had no memory of who she was or where she came from. Lucas pulled out another document. The hospital tried to locate family, but with no name or identification, they eventually released her to social services. Since then, she's bounced between temporary shelters and 3 different foster homes. She ran away from the last one 8 months ago. Carlos stared at the papers, his mind racing. The timing. The necklace. Mr. Rivera, Lucas said carefully. I don't want to give you false hope, but these coincidences are difficult to ignore. From upstairs came the sound of running water. Clara was taking a shower. Elena had bought her new clothes, and the girl had been hesitant but grateful. There's something else, Carlos said suddenly, standing up. Something I need to check. He moved toward the stairs, Lucas following quietly behind. They waited in the hallway until they heard the water shut off and gave Clara time to dress. Carlos knocked gently on the guest room door. Clara, may I come in for a moment? Yes, came the soft reply. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her wet hair combed back, wearing a simple blue t-shirt and jeans. She looked up at Carlos with cautious eyes. Clara, Carlos said gently, would you mind if I looked at your shoulder? Your left shoulder? The girl frowned slightly but nodded, turning so her back faced him. Carlos carefully moved the collar of her shirt aside, revealing her shoulder blade. There it was, a small, crescent-shaped birthmark like a tiny half-moon, exactly like the one Amelia had been born with. Carlos's hand trembled as he stepped back, his eyes meeting Lucas's over Clara's head. Thank you, he whispered to Clara, his voice thick with emotion. The next morning, Carlos sat at the breakfast table earlier than usual. He arranged a small vase of fresh flowers in the center and asked Elena to prepare pancakes, something he hadn't requested in years. Would you like blueberries in them? Elena asked, a knowing smile on her face. Yes, Carlos replied, and some chocolate chips too. Kids like chocolate chips, don't they? Elena nodded, her eyes warm. They certainly do. When Clara came downstairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes, she paused in the doorway. The kitchen smelled of butter and sweet batter. Carlos looked up from his newspaper and smiled. Good morning, he said softly. I thought we could have breakfast together. Clara slid into the chair across from him, her eyes wide at the stack of pancakes Elena placed before her. Thank you, she whispered. Would you like to feed the birds after breakfast? Carlos asked. There's a family of cardinals that visits the garden every morning. Clara nodded, cutting into her pancakes with careful precision. Days passed, and routines formed naturally between them. Each evening, Carlos would select a book from the library shelves and read to Clara in the living room. She would curl up on the sofa, listening intently as his deep voice brought stories to life. My father used to read to me, she said one evening, then looked confused. At least, I think he did. Carlos's hand stilled on the page. What else do you remember? Clara shrugged, her face scrunched in concentration. Just feelings, mostly. Someone tucking me in. A song. In the garden, they established a ritual of filling the bird feeders together. Carlos would lift Clara up so she could reach the highest ones, her small hands carefully pouring seed into the wooden trays. The red ones are my favorite, she said, pointing to a cardinal perched on a nearby branch. Mine too, Carlos replied, his voice catching. From the kitchen window, Elena watched them, her heart full. Later, as Clara helped her dry dishes, Elena gently squeezed the girl's shoulder. You know, she said quietly, I haven't seen Mr. Rivera smile like that in years. You're helping him more than you know. Clara looked up, her eyes curious. Was he sad before? Elena nodded. Very sad. But you're bringing light back into this house. That night, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, Carlos found himself standing outside Clara's door. He hesitated, then quietly turned the knob. The moonlight spilled across her sleeping form. She had kicked off her blankets, and Carlos gently pulled them back over her shoulders. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch feather-light. Clara's eyes fluttered open. "Carlos?" she murmured sleepily. "I'm sorry I woke you," he whispered. "Go back to sleep." She nestled deeper into her pillow. "I feel like I've been here before," she whispered, her voice drifting. "In this room. It feels like home." Carlos stood frozen, a tear sliding down his cheek as he watched her fall back asleep. The next afternoon, Carlos and Clara sat in the garden, watching butterflies dance between the flowers. Clara had been quiet all morning, her small fingers tracing patterns on her heart pendant. "Carlos?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you have a daughter?" The question hung in the air between them. Carlos's breath caught in his throat, and his hands trembled slightly as he set down his cup of tea. "Yes," he said after a long moment. "Her name was Amelia." Clara's eyes widened. What was she like? Carlos looked up at the sky, his eyes misting over. She was bright, full of life. She loved to draw and sing. He smiled sadly. She had a laugh that could fill up the whole house. "What happened to her?" Clara asked, her voice gentle. Carlos swallowed hard. "There was an accident on a boat. We were caught in a storm and—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara reached across and placed her small hand over his. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Carlos nodded, careful not to reveal his suspicions. He couldn't bear to give her false hope, or himself. Later that afternoon, Lucas Delgado arrived with a folder tucked under his arm. His face was flushed with excitement. "I found her," he said the moment Carlos opened the door, "the nurse who admitted Clara to the hospital 5 years ago." Carlos ushered him into his study, closing the door behind them. "Tell me everything." "Her name is Hilda Martinez. She retired 3 years ago and moved to a small cottage in the countryside." Lucas pulled out a notepad. "I tracked her down yesterday." "Carlos, she remembers Clara clearly." Carlos leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What did she say?" "She said a fisherman brought in a little girl around 5 years old who had been found near a wrecked dock after a terrible storm." Lucas's voice quickened with urgency. The girl was confused, suffering from exposure and memory loss. But here's the important part. She was wearing a heart-shaped pendant. Hilda remembered it specifically because the girl wouldn't let anyone touch it. Carlos gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "A wrecked dock? After a storm?" "Yes," Lucas confirmed. "The timing matches the accident, Carlos, and the location is less than 20 miles downshore from where your boat capsized." Carlos stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I want a DNA test. Now." Lucas nodded. "I've already looked into it, but the lab is backlogged. It could take weeks for results." "Weeks?" Carlos's voice cracked. "I need to know if she's my daughter." "I understand," Lucas said gently. "But we need to be thorough, and we need to consider what this means for Clara. If she is Amelia, she's been through trauma we can barely imagine." Carlos sank back into his chair, torn between desperate hope and paralyzing fear. "All these years," he whispered. "Could she really have been alive all this time?" Carlos stood in the hallway staring at Clara's closed bedroom door. A memory washed over him. 3 years ago, when a social worker had called. "Mr. Rivera," she had said gently, "there's a lovely little girl who needs a home. Would you consider—" "No," he had cut her off. "I can't replace my daughter." It had been the third such call that year. Each time his answer was the same. How could he give another child Amelia's place? It felt like betrayal. Elena appeared beside him now, holding a small pile of folded clothes. Clara needs new shoes, she said softly. The ones she has are falling apart. Carlos nodded. I'll take her shopping tomorrow. That evening, Carlos sat at the kitchen table helping Clara with math problems. His fingers, once nimble with spreadsheets and financial reports, now clumsily guided hers across the page. Like this? Clara asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. Exactly right, Carlos said, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It had been so long since he'd taught anyone anything. The next morning, Carlos found himself sitting behind Clara on her bed, trying to braid her hair before breakfast. His fingers fumbled with the strands. Am I hurting you? He asked when she winced. No, Clara said, but Elena does it differently. Carlos chuckled. I'm sure she does. I haven't braided hair since… He paused, swallowing hard. It's been a long time. Elena watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening. Later, she whispered to him, You're remembering how to be a father again. That afternoon, Carlos returned from a meeting to find Clara sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by colored pencils. She looked up when he entered. I made something, she said, holding up a drawing. Carlos sat beside her, taking the paper. His heart stopped. The drawing showed a small boat on rough water. A woman stood on the shore, arms outstretched toward a tiny figure in the waves. What is this? He asked, his voice barely audible. Clara shrugged. I don't know, I keep dreaming about it. There's a lady calling to me in the water. Carlos stared at the drawing, his hands trembling. The woman's face was indistinct, but her posture, the way she reached out, was unmistakably like his wife's. Is it a bad drawing? Clara asked, noticing his expression. No, Carlos managed. It's very good. He stood abruptly, handing the drawing back to her. Excuse me for a moment. Carlos walked calmly to his study, closed the door, and then collapsed against it, sliding to the floor. Tears streamed down his face as silent sobs shook his body. It was the first time he had cried since the memorial service. Elena found him there minutes later, still weeping. She remembers, he whispered. Elena, she remembers. Lucas Delgado stood in the dimly lit hospital records room, his expression serious as he slid a USB drive across the desk to Carlos. The private investigator had spent 3 days convincing the hospital administration to release the security footage from 5 years ago. It took some doing, Lucas said quietly, but I found it. The night Clara was brought in. Carlos's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the small device. You've seen it? Lucas nodded. It's grainy, but it's there. Everything matches the nurse's story. 20 minutes later, Carlos sat alone in a small viewing room the hospital had provided, his eyes fixed on the ancient monitor. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., dated exactly 5 years and 2 months after the boating accident. The emergency entrance doors slid open, and a figure hurried in, a man carrying a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a dark raincoat. Carlos leaned closer, squinting at the fuzzy image. The man's face was mostly obscured, turned away from the camera. But the child… Carlos's breath caught in his throat. The little girl's face was visible for just a moment as the man spoke urgently to the reception nurse. Her hair was matted, her expression dazed. Around her neck, catching the harsh hospital lights, was a heart-shaped pendant. Carlos rewound the footage, played it again, then again. Each time his eyes fixed on different details, the way the man's hand protectively cradled the child's head, the girl's confused expression, the pendant swinging as she was carried. Who was he? Carlos whispered to the empty room. Where did he find you? He was so absorbed in the footage that he didn't hear the door open behind him. Carlos! He turned to find Benjamin Cortez standing there, his expression a mixture of concern and exasperation. Benjamin, how did you know I was here? Benjamin sighed, closing the door. Elena called me. She's worried about you, said you've barely slept in days. Carlos gestured to the screen. Look at this, it's her, Benjamin. Look at the necklace. Benjamin watched the footage play through once, his face unreadable. When it ended, he pulled up a chair beside Carlos. I know what you're thinking, he said gently. and I understand why. But Carlos, you need to slow down. Slow down? Carlos's voice rose slightly. I've wasted 5 years already. You're setting yourself up for heartbreak again, Benjamin said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Remember what happened after the accident? The psychics, the false sightings, the private investigators who took your money and gave you nothing but false hope? It nearly destroyed you. Carlos stared at the frozen image on the screen, the heart pendant, identical to the one that now hung around Clara's neck. This is different, he said firmly. This isn't some con artist's trick. It's real evidence. Even if there's a connection, it might not be what you think, Benjamin warned. The necklace could have been sold, given away. Or it could be exactly what I think, Carlos interrupted, standing up. Maybe I'm finally setting things right. Benjamin looked at his old friend, at the fire in his eyes that had been absent for so long. Just promise me you'll be careful, with your heart and with hers. Later that evening, Carlos sat with Clara at the dining room table, helping her with a jigsaw puzzle. Elena had made hot chocolate, and the warm, sweet scent filled the room. This piece goes here, Clara said, fitting a puzzle piece into place. See? It's part of the castle tower. Good eye, Carlos said, smiling. You've always been good at seeing how things fit together. Clara paused, looking up at him with curious eyes. How do you know that? You've only known me for a little while. Carlos hesitated, suddenly aware of his mistake. I meant, you seem to be good at it. Clara nodded, accepting this, and returned to the puzzle. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes. Can you pass me that blue piece, Dad? She asked absently, then froze, her eyes widening as she realized what she'd said. I'm sorry, I didn't. Carlos felt his heart swell in his chest, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in years. It's okay, he said softly, passing her the puzzle piece. He didn't correct her, didn't tell her to call him Carlos. Instead, he simply continued working on the puzzle, pretending not to notice the small, relieved smile that appeared on Clara's face. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, painting everything in a warm, golden glow. Clara stood at the counter beside Elena, carefully cracking eggs into a bowl. Her face lit up with concentration as she worked, her tongue poking out slightly between her teeth. No shells this time, she announced proudly, showing Elena the clean bowl of eggs. Perfect, Elena praised, her weathered hands guiding Clara's smaller ones as they whisked. You're becoming quite the little chef. Clara giggled, a sound that seemed to brighten the kitchen even more than the sunshine. My pancakes are going to be heart-shaped, she declared, and yours can be stars, and Carlos's can be circles because he's so serious. Elena laughed softly. That's very thoughtful of you. Neither of them noticed Carlos standing in the doorway watching. His throat tightened as Clara began to hum, that same haunting lullaby that had stopped him in his tracks days before. The melody his wife had sung to Amelia every night. Clara twirled away from the counter, still humming, and spotted him. Carlos, we're making surprise pancakes. You're not supposed to see yet? Sorry, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I couldn't help myself. Elena caught his eye over Clara's head, her own eyes shining. They both felt it. The house hadn't been this bright, this alive in years. The walls that had once seemed to absorb all joy now seemed to reflect it back, multiplied. Carlos's phone buzzed in his pocket. Lucas Delgado's name flashed on the screen. I found her, Lucas said without preamble. Nurse Hilda Jensen. She's retired now, living about an hour outside the city. She remembers Clara. Carlos's heart raced. When can we meet her? Today, if you want. She agreed to talk, but Lucas paused. She said to tell you that what she knows may not give you peace. I need to know anyway, Carlos said firmly. Text me the address. By early afternoon, Carlos was sliding into the passenger seat of Lucas's sedan. He'd promised Clara he would return before dark, leaving her happily helping Elena prepare a special dinner. Are you ready for this? Lucas asked as they pulled away from the mansion. Carlos stared out at the rolling hills that led away from the city. "I've been ready for 5 years," he answered quietly. The drive passed mostly in silence, Carlos lost in thought as countryside replaced suburbs. Finally, they turned onto a narrow gravel road that led to a small cottage surrounded by wildflowers. A woman with silver hair stood on the porch watching their approach. Her face was kind but solemn, lined with years of witnessing both life's beginnings and its tragedies. "Nurse Hilda," Lucas said as they approached. She nodded, her eyes fixed on Carlos. "Mr. Rivera," she said softly, "I've been expecting you for a very long time." Nurse Hilda led Carlos and Lucas into her modest living room. Shelves lined with photographs of children she'd helped bring into the world decorated the walls. She settled into a worn armchair, her hands folded in her lap. "It was a terrible storm that night," she began, her voice soft but clear. "The kind that makes you pray for those out on the water. I was working the late shift in the ER when he came in." Carlos leaned forward. "Who?" "A fisherman, soaked to the bone, carrying this tiny bundle wrapped in his rain jacket." Nurse Hilda's eyes grew distant with memory. The little girl couldn't have been more than 3 or 4. She was shivering something awful with a nasty bump on her head and a high fever. Wouldn't speak a word. Carlos's breath caught. "And the necklace?" Nurse Hilda nodded. "She clutched it like it was her lifeline. Wouldn't let anyone touch it, not even when we changed her into dry clothes." She looked directly at Carlos. "Heart-shaped, just like you described." "Did the fisherman say anything about where he found her?" Lucas asked. "Not much. He was a weathered man, maybe 50 or 60, refused to give his name." Nurse Hilda's voice dropped lower. All he said was, "I found her drifting ashore, barely breathing. God spared her." Then he left before the police arrived. Carlos stood abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, the same sun shone that had illuminated his kitchen that morning, where Clara had hummed that lullaby. "That was Amelia," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "My daughter survived." Nurse Hilda watched him with compassion. "The poor child had no memories. We tried for weeks, but she couldn't tell us her name or where she came from. Just nightmares about water." "And no one searched for a connection to the boating accident?" Lucas asked, his tone professional but gentle. "The authorities did check missing persons reports," Nurse Hilda sighed, "but with no body recovered from your accident, Mr. Rivera, and the child found miles down the coast. They assumed she was someone else's lost child." Carlos turned back, wiping his eyes. "All these years," he said, his voice breaking, "she was alive, just lost." Later, as they drove back toward the city, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Carlos stared out the window, his face set with newfound determination. "This isn't coincidence," he told Lucas firmly. "That pendant, the scar, the memories. She's mine. I know it." Lucas glanced at him. "The DNA test will confirm it." "I don't need a test to tell me what my heart already knows," Carlos replied. "I've found my daughter." As the days passed, Clara's presence brought life back to the Rivera mansion. Where silence once reigned, laughter now echoed through the hallways. Carlos found himself looking forward to mornings when Clara would join him for breakfast, her face bright with questions about the day ahead. One sunny afternoon, they sat in the garden, planting flowers in the beds that had been neglected for years. Clara patted the soil around a small rose bush, her hands covered in dirt. "Dad, can you pass me the watering can?" she asked, the words slipping out naturally. Carlos froze, the watering can suspended in midair. Unlike the first time when she'd called him that by accident, this time Clara didn't look embarrassed. She simply waited, her eyes meeting his. "Here you go," he said softly, handing it to her. His heart swelled with a mixture of joy and fear. Later that night, after tucking Clara into bed, Carlos sat alone in his study, staring at old photographs of Amelia. The resemblance was uncanny. The same curve of the smile, the same dimple in the left cheek when she laughed. "I know it's you," he whispered to the photo, "but what if I'm wrong?" He couldn't bring himself to tell Clara his suspicions. The thought of raising her hopes only to crush them if the DNA test came back negative was too painful to bear. Better to wait for certainty, he told himself. His phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. Lucas Delgado's name flashed on the screen. "Mr. Rivera." Lucas's voice sounded apologetic. "I'm afraid there's been another delay with the DNA test. The lab says your sample was mislabeled, and they need to repeat the process." "What?" Carlos's voice rose sharply. "It's been 2 weeks already. How much longer?" "Another 10 days at least." Carlos slammed his fist on the desk. "This is unacceptable. Don't they understand what's at stake here?" After ending the call, Carlos paced his study, frustration boiling over. When Benjamin Cortez arrived for their scheduled meeting, Carlos was still seething. "10 more days, Ben, 10!" Carlos exclaimed. "I can't keep living in this limbo." Benjamin set his briefcase down. "Maybe this is a sign to slow down, Carlos. You're getting too attached before you know the truth." "What if she is Amelia? What then?" Carlos challenged. "And what if she isn't?" Benjamin countered. "What happens to that child when you have to let her go?" Neither man noticed Clara standing in the hallway, having come downstairs for a glass of water. She froze at Benjamin's words, her small hand clutching the doorframe. "I can't just send her back to the streets," Carlos argued. "I'm not saying that," Benjamin sighed, "but you need to prepare yourself for all possibilities." Clara backed away silently, her heart pounding. They were talking about getting rid of her. After all, why would someone like Carlos Rivera want to keep a nobody like her? She'd been foolish to think she belonged here, to call him Dad. Tears welled in her eyes as she crept back upstairs, the warm feeling of belonging replaced by the cold fear of rejection she knew all too well. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The words she'd overheard kept playing in her mind. "What happens to that child when you have to let her go?" Benjamin had asked. Clara tossed and turned, her heart heavy with the thought that she didn't truly belong here. At midnight, when the house was still and silent, Clara slipped out of bed. She pulled her worn backpack from under the bed, the same one she'd had when Carlos first found her. With trembling hands, she packed her few belongings, a change of clothes, the toothbrush Elena had given her, and the small stuffed bear Carlos had bought her last week. She paused at her desk, tears blurring her vision. Taking a sheet of paper, she carefully drew a picture of herself and Carlos holding hands under a bright sun. They were both smiling in the drawing. With a shaky hand, she wrote beneath it, "Thank you for letting me be your daughter, even if just for a while." Clara placed the drawing on her pillow, took one last look around the room that had briefly been hers, and quietly crept down the stairs. She knew how to avoid the creaky third step and which floorboards would give her away. The front door opened with barely a sound, and then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Carlos, unable to sleep, had been working in his study. A strange feeling of unease washed over him. He decided to check on Clara, something he'd taken to doing each night. When he pushed open her bedroom door and saw the empty bed, his heart stopped. Then he spotted the drawing on her pillow. "No, no, no," he whispered, snatching up the paper. His hands shook as he read the caption. "Clara!" he shouted, running through the house, checking every room. "Clara, where are you?" The house remained silent. With panic rising in his throat, Carlos called Lucas Delgado first, then Benjamin Cortez. "She's gone," he choked out. "Clara's run away. She must have overheard us talking earlier." Within an hour, both men arrived at the mansion. Benjamin organized a search party while Lucas contacted his network of street informants. Carlos paced the foyer, clutching Clara's drawing. "She couldn't have gone far," Lucas reassured him. "We'll find her, Mr. Rivera." Meanwhile, Clara wandered through the sleeping city, her small form huddled against the cold. She had no destination in mind, yet her feet seemed to know where to go. Street by street, she made her way toward the harbor, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The smell of salt water and fish grew stronger. Clara found herself standing at the edge of the docks, staring out at the dark water that seemed to call to her. This place felt strangely familiar, like a half-remembered dream. "I've been here before," she whispered to herself, not understanding why tears were streaming down her face or why her heart ached with a loss she couldn't name. Out of nowhere, Carlos spotted Clara's small silhouette on a pier near the edge of the docks. His heart lurched in his chest. She stood perfectly still, watching the waves crash against the wooden posts below, her hair blowing in the cool night breeze. Clara, he whispered, afraid that calling too loudly might startle her into the dark waters below. Carlos approached slowly, his footsteps careful on the weathered boards. When he was just a few feet away, Clara turned, her eyes wide and red from crying. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. "I thought you didn't want me anymore." Carlos knelt beside her, his own eyes filling with tears. He reached out, gently taking her small hands in his. "Wherever you came from, you're where you belong now," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "With me." Clara's face crumpled, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing against his shoulder. Carlos held her tightly as if afraid she might disappear again, rocking her gently as tears streamed down his own face. "I was so scared," he whispered into her hair. "Please don't ever leave like that again." They stayed that way for several minutes, father and daughter reunited under the stars, the water lapping beneath them, the very water that had once torn them apart. Lucas's car pulled up at the dock entrance. He stepped out, followed by a professional-looking woman in a dark coat. "That's Ms. Diane Keller," Lucas explained as they approached. "She's a social worker I contacted during the search. She has Clara's original file." Ms. Keller smiled warmly at Clara, who still clung to Carlos. "I've been reviewing your hospital intake records," she said, opening a folder. "And I found something interesting tucked inside." She pulled out a small yellowed tag that had been hidden behind another document. It was handwritten by the admitting nurse 5 years ago. Carlos stared at the tag, his breath catching in his throat. There in faded blue ink were the words, "Emilia R." 3 days later, Lucas called Carlos early in the morning. His voice trembled with excitement. "The DNA test results are back, Mr. Rivera. Can you come to my office?" Carlos gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He drove with shaking hands, barely noticing the familiar streets passing by. Elena had agreed to watch Clara for the morning, telling her Carlos had an important meeting. When he arrived at Lucas's office, the private investigator was waiting with an envelope on his desk. "I wanted you to be the first to see this," Lucas said, sliding the envelope across to Carlos. With trembling fingers, Carlos opened it and unfolded the paper inside. The clinical language blurred before his eyes until he found the conclusion at the bottom. 99.99998% probability of paternity. A perfect match. Clara was Emilia Rivera, his daughter. Carlos covered his face with his hands and broke down, his shoulders heaving with deep, wrenching sobs. Years of grief and loneliness poured out of him in waves. "All these years, she was never gone," he whispered between sobs. "My little girl was out there all along." Lucas placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "She found her way back to you." That afternoon, Carlos returned home with a small velvet box tucked in his pocket. Clara was in the garden with Elena, laughing as they planted flowers. "Clara," he called softly, "can you come here for a moment?" She approached, curious, her eyes bright. Carlos knelt down to her level, taking both her hands in his. "I have something for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He opened the velvet box, revealing a new locket, 2 hearts intertwined. Carefully, he placed it around her neck, his fingers brushing against the original pendant she still wore. "Welcome home, Emilia," he whispered. Clara's eyes widened. Something flickered in their depths, recognition, memory awakening. Her small hand reached up to touch the new locket, then her old one. I remember the boat," she said slowly, "and Mom singing to me in the water." Tears filled her eyes as fragments of memory returned like puzzle pieces finding their places. "I remember you," she whispered. "Dad." That night, Carlos couldn't bear to be far from his daughter. After tucking Emilia into bed with extra care, he positioned a chair outside her bedroom door. He sat there like a guardian, the DNA test result still clutched in his hand. Every few minutes he would unfold the paper and read it again, as if afraid the words might change if he looked away too long. "My daughter," he whispered to himself, the words still feeling strange and wonderful on his lips. He hadn't told her yet. The truth felt too big, too important to rush. She needed time to feel safe first. He would find the perfect moment to explain everything. Around midnight, Carlos heard a small sound from inside the bedroom. The door creaked open, and Emilia stood there, her eyes half closed, her movements dreamlike. She was sleepwalking. "Emilia?" he whispered. But she didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him and down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Carlos followed quietly, watching as she entered his room and curled up on the small couch by the window. She pulled her knees to her chest and settled there, still deep in sleep. Carlos stood in the doorway, his heart aching with tenderness. He carefully draped a blanket over her small form but didn't try to move her. This was her home. She could sleep wherever she felt safe. He settled into the armchair across from her and kept watch through the night. When morning light filtered through the curtains, Emilia's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion crossed her face as she realized where she was. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Carlos said gently. "You're always welcome here." After breakfast, Carlos called Benjamin. "I need your advice," he said when his friend answered. "It's about Emilia." "How is she adjusting?" Benjamin asked. "Better than I could have hoped," Carlos replied, watching through the window as Emilia helped Elena gather herbs from the garden. "But it's time I tell her everything. She deserves to know the truth." The next morning, Carlos woke early. Today was the day. He made Emilia's favorite breakfast, pancakes with strawberries, and watched her eat with a quiet joy that filled his chest. "I'd like to show you something special," he said when she finished. "In the garden." Emilia followed him outside, curious. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn as Carlos led her to the far corner, where overgrown shrubs partially hid something beneath them. He knelt down and gently brushed away some leaves, revealing the broken remains of a tiny castle, its towers still standing despite the years of neglect. "You built this," he said softly. "We built it together when you were 5. Emilia touched one of the small towers with her fingertips. "I remember something. The smell of the wet sand. Your laugh." Carlos took a deep breath. "Emilia, there's something I need to tell you." He patted the grass beside him, and she sat down. 5 years ago, we were on a boat. You, me, and your mother. There was a storm. His voice cracked. The boat capsized. I couldn't find either of you. The search teams looked for weeks, but they never found. I thought I'd lost you forever. Tears welled in Emilia's eyes as Carlos continued, explaining how he'd spotted her necklace that night on the street, the investigation, and the DNA test that confirmed what his heart already knew. "You're my daughter, Emilia, you always were." Emilia's tears fell freely now, but her face held no fear, only relief. She leaned against Carlos's shoulder. "I don't remember everything yet," she whispered, "but I know I'm not lost anymore." Carlos wrapped his arm around her, his own tears falling into her hair. Later that afternoon, Lucas Delgado arrived at the front door, his expression serious. "I have news," he said after Carlos invited him in. "The local paper got wind of Emilia's story. A reporter is asking for an exclusive interview with both of you." Carlos frowned. "I don't know if we're ready for that kind of attention." Carlos stood at the window of his study, watching Emilia help Elena plant flowers in the garden. The scene brought back a memory from years ago, standing on a stage at the annual Tech Innovation Summit, delivering what many had called his most inspiring speech. "The legacy we build isn't measured in dollars or buildings," he had told the audience of entrepreneurs and investors. "It's measured by the lives we touch, the differences we make that outlast us." Back then, he'd been talking about technological innovation and charitable foundations. He never imagined his true legacy would be found in the miracle of his daughter returning to him. The empire he'd built seemed hollow compared to the simple joy of watching Emilia laugh in the garden. As time went on, Emilia began to open up more. Each day brought small victories in her healing journey. She drew pictures of her early memories, fragments of boats, waves, and a woman's face that Carlos recognized as his late wife. Elena had begun homeschooling her, patiently helping her catch up on years of missed education. They'd developed their own special bond, with Elena teaching Amelia to bake her grandmother's cookie recipes. "She made snickerdoodles today," Elena told Carlos with pride, "just like her mother used to." Carlos's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Lucas. "I found him," Lucas said without preamble. "The fisherman who brought Amelia to the hospital 5 years ago. His name is Paul Dyer, a Vietnam veteran living in a small coastal town about 2 hours from the city. Keeps to himself mostly, but my contact says he's willing to talk to you." Carlos's heart raced. "You're sure it's him?" "Positive. He remembered the heart-shaped pendant. Said he's never forgotten the little girl he pulled from the water that night." At dusk, Carlos and Amelia drove along the coastal highway. The setting sun painted the ocean in shades of orange and gold. Amelia sat quietly in the passenger seat, nervously turning the double heart pendant in her small hands. "Are you okay?" Carlos asked, glancing at his daughter. "What if he doesn't want to see us?" Amelia's voice was barely above a whisper. Carlos reached across and squeezed her hand. "Then we'll thank him anyway. He saved you, sweetheart. Without him, we wouldn't be together now." They pulled up to a weathered blue cottage perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. A rusted pickup truck sat in the driveway, and fishing gear was scattered across the porch. Paul Dyer met them at the door before they could knock. He was a tall man with silver hair and deep lines etched into his sun-weathered face. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You the rich guy who's been looking for me?" His voice was gruff, defensive. "I didn't do nothing wrong." "Mr. Dyer," Carlos said gently, "we're not here to cause trouble. We just wanted to thank you." Paul's gaze shifted to Amelia, and his tough expression softened instantly. "My God," he whispered. "It's really you." "Please," Carlos said. "May we come in?" Inside the modest home, they sat at a kitchen table overlooking the ocean. Paul's hands trembled as he poured them glasses of lemonade. "She was floating on a piece of wood," Paul said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I thought she was a ghost at first. Just this tiny thing so still in the water." Amelia listened, her eyes wide, absorbing this piece of her lost history. "I pulled her into my boat," Paul continued. "She was breathing, but she wouldn't speak, just held onto that heart necklace like it was keeping her alive." He looked down, shame crossing his face. "I never reported finding her. I was afraid they'd blame me somehow. I just took her to the ER and disappeared. I thought it was the safest thing." Carlos nodded, understanding rather than judgment in his eyes. "You saved her life." Amelia stood up and walked to Paul's side. She placed the double heart pendant in his weathered hand. "This is for you," she said softly. "Thank you for saving me." Tears filled the old fisherman's eyes. "I've thought about you every day for 5 years," he confessed, "wondering if you were okay." "I am now," Amelia said, wrapping her small arms around his neck in a gentle hug. "I'm home." 3 weeks after meeting Paul Dyer, Carlos sat in the makeup chair of the Channel 8 studio. A woman dabbed powder on his forehead while another adjusted his microphone. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Amelia asked, swinging her legs from her own chair beside him. Carlos smiled. "A little, are you?" Amelia shook her head. "No, we're just telling our story, right?" Her simple confidence warmed his heart. She wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, and the double heart pendant hung around her neck. She'd insisted on buying another one for Paul to keep. "2 minutes, Mr. Rivera," the floor director called. Soon they were seated on a plush couch across from Valerie Torres, the host of Morning Connections. The red light on the camera blinked on. "Today we have an extraordinary story," Valerie began. 5 years ago, businessman Carlos Rivera lost his daughter in a boating accident. Or so he thought. The interview unfolded naturally. Carlos described the accident, the years of grief, and the miraculous moment he spotted Amelia's necklace on a street corner. "What made you stop that day?" Valerie asked. Carlos looked at Amelia. "Something inside me recognized her," even before my mind could understand it. When it was Amelia's turn to speak, she sat up straight, her voice clear and steady. "I didn't remember who I was for a long time," she said, "but my dad never stopped looking for me, even when he thought I was gone forever." She turned to the camera, her eyes bright. "I was lost, but I wasn't forgotten." The studio audience wiped away tears. Valerie herself had to pause to compose herself. "What's next for you both?" she finally asked. Carlos took a deep breath. "There are thousands of children lost in the system. Some have families searching for them, some don't. We want to help. We're starting the Amelia Rivera Foundation," he continued, "to help reconnect families and support children who've fallen through the cracks." By that evening, the interview had gone viral. Carlos's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Email after email poured in. Desperate parents sharing stories of missing children, asking for help, for hope. "Dad?" Amelia found Carlos in his study, surrounded by these messages. "Are you okay?" Carlos looked up, his eyes clear with purpose. "I spent years building companies, thinking that was my legacy. But this, helping families find each other, this is what I was meant to do." Amelia smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "We can do it together." Days turned into weeks, and Carlos launched the Amelia Heart Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to reuniting displaced children with their families. The grand opening took place on a sunny Tuesday morning, with a small crowd gathered outside a renovated 2-story building next to the hospital, where Amelia had been dropped off 5 years ago. "It feels right to be here," Carlos told Lucas as they watched workers hang the foundation's sign, a heart-shaped logo with a tiny boat inside it. "This is where her journey back to me began." Lucas nodded, clipboard in hand. "We've already received 43 cases to investigate, families from all over the country." Inside, Amelia moved from room to room with focused determination. She hung colorful drawings on walls, arranged stuffed animals on shelves, and placed soft rugs on the floors of play areas. Each space was designed to make frightened children feel safe. "What do you think of this one, Elena?" Amelia held up a painting of a lighthouse beaming across dark waters. Elena smiled as she organized a shelf of children's books. "It's perfect, mija. It shows the way home." In the kitchen area, Elena demonstrated to a group of volunteers how to prepare simple, comforting meals. "Many of these children have gone without regular meals," she explained. "Food is more than nutrition, it's security." She moved on to showing them how to approach children who might be scared or withdrawn. "Never force contact. Let them come to you. Remember, trust is earned slowly when it's been broken before." Carlos stood in the doorway watching it all unfold. His daughter, his miracle, pointing to where pillows should go in the reading nook. Elena, who had kept his heart beating during the darkest years, now teaching others to heal wounded spirits. Lucas at his desk in the new investigation room, already building case files. Tears welled in Carlos's eyes, but they weren't tears of pain anymore. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace wash over him, not just because he had found Amelia, but because together they were creating something meaningful from their pain. "Mr. Rivera?" A young volunteer approached him. "We're ready for the ribbon cutting whenever you are." Carlos nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. "Let me get my daughter, we should do it together." At that moment, during the Amelia Heart Foundation's soft launch, a young boy with tousled brown hair and tear-stained cheeks clung to his teenage sister. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The volunteers offered him juice boxes and small toys, but he shrank back, burying his face in his sister's shoulder. Amelia noticed right away. She set down the clipboard she'd been holding and walked slowly to the snack table. She picked up a chocolate chip cookie and approached the pair, kneeling down to the boy's eye level. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Amelia." The boy didn't answer, but he peeked at her from behind his sister's arm. "I was scared too when I first came to a place with strangers," Amelia said, placing the cookie on the table between them. She didn't push it toward him or insist he take it. She simply sat down cross-legged on the floor nearby and waited. Carlos Rivera watched from across the room, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and wonder. Elena stood beside him, her eyes misty as she observed the scene. "Look at her," Carlos whispered. "She's no longer the lost child. She's the one helping others find their way." Elena nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "She has your strength and her mother's heart." After a few minutes, the boy reached for the cookie, taking a tiny bite. Emilia smiled but didn't crowd him. She simply started talking about the fish tank in the corner and how the blue fish reminded her of the ocean. Later that day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn in front of the center, Emilia stood with a small shovel in her hands. A crowd gathered around her, Carlos, Elena, Lucas, and the volunteer staff, as she carefully planted a cherry blossom sapling in the freshly dug hole. "This is Mom's tree," she announced, patting the soil around the slender trunk. Her voice was clear and steady. "So she knows we're doing something beautiful." Carlos felt tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter water the sapling. The wind gently rustled the few leaves on the young tree, as if Maria was there, touching them with her approval. "She would be so proud of you," Carlos said, placing his hand on Emilia's shoulder. "I think she knows," Emilia replied, looking up at the sky. "I think she's been helping us all along." Eventually, Carlos found himself standing before a polished mahogany table surrounded by 5 stern-faced executives in crisp suits. These were his former colleagues, people who had once admired his business acumen. Now they looked at him with thinly veiled skepticism. "The numbers don't add up, Carlos," said Richard Winters, tapping his finger on the spreadsheet. "This foundation is not scalable. The cost per child located is astronomical. And the success rate is unpredictable," added Vanessa Chen, adjusting her glasses. "We can't project reliable outcomes." Carlos took a deep breath. He thought of Emilia's face when they'd found her, the way her eyes had lit up when she finally remembered him. How could he put a price tag on that? "With all due respect," Carlos said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "not everything valuable can be measured on a spreadsheet. If we can reunite just one more child with their family, then it's worth every cent." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I'm not asking you to fund a dream," Carlos continued. "I'm inviting you to change lives, real lives, children who are lost and families who are broken without them." He placed his hand on his heart. "I lived in that darkness for 5 years. If I can spare even one parent from that pain, I'll consider it a success." Back at the Foundation Center, Emilia sat at her small desk sorting through the mail. Most were donation checks or thank you notes from families they'd helped. But one envelope caught her eye, pale blue with handwriting that looked like a child's. She carefully opened it and pulled out a lined paper covered in purple ink. "Dear Emilia," it read, "I saw you on TV. I think I might be like you. I don't remember my real family, but I have dreams about a yellow house with a big tree. My foster mom is nice, but sometimes I feel like I belong somewhere else. Can you help me find where I'm supposed to be? From Lily." Emilia's hands trembled as she read the letter again. There was an address from a town 3 hours away. When Carlos returned from his meeting, Emilia was waiting by the door, letter in hand. "Dad," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "Let's go find her." The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the car windows as Carlos scraped them clean. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Inside the car, Emilia sat bundled in a thick scarf and mittens, clutching the blue letter against her chest. "Are you sure you're warm enough?" Carlos asked, sliding into the driver's seat. Emilia nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I'm fine, Dad. Do you think she'll like me?" Carlos smiled at his daughter. "She already does. That's why she wrote to you." The journey took them across state lines, through small towns dusted with snow, and past endless fields of white. They spoke little during the drive, both lost in thought about the child waiting for them at the end of their journey. 3 hours later, they pulled up to a modest brick house with green shutters. A wreath of pine branches hung on the front door. "This is it," Carlos said, checking the address one last time. Emilia clutched a small gift box in her hands as they walked up to the porch. Carlos knocked on the door, and moments later, it opened to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "Mrs. Patterson?" Carlos asked. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her gaze moving between them. "You must be Mr. Rivera and Amelia." Her eyes softened when they landed on Amelia. "Lily hasn't stopped talking about you since she saw you on television." She ushered them inside, where a small girl with dark braids sat on the living room floor surrounded by colored pencils and paper. When she looked up and saw Amelia, her eyes widened. "You came," she whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly might make them disappear. Amelia walked over and sat cross-legged on the floor beside her. "I liked your letter," she said simply. While the girls began to talk, Carlos followed Mrs. Patterson into the kitchen. "I don't want to give Lily false hope," the grandmother said quietly, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "She was adopted from a shelter that closed years ago. The records are scattered, if they exist at all." Carlos nodded. "We understand. We're not promising miracles, but we can try." "She dreams about her birth family," Mrs. Patterson continued. "I've raised her since she was 3, but she's always felt incomplete, like a part of her story is missing." "I know that feeling," Carlos said, watching through the doorway as Amelia showed Lily her drawings. In the living room, Amelia was opening the small gift box she had brought. Inside was a silver heart pendant, smaller than the one she wore but identical in design. "This is for you," Amelia said, placing it in Lily's palm. "When I was lost, this necklace was the only thing that stayed with me. It helped my dad find me." Lily's fingers closed around the pendant. "But I don't have anyone looking for me." "You don't know that," Amelia said gently. "And now you have us looking too. You'll know who you are," she added, "even if it takes time." Carlos watched from the doorway, his heart full. 5 years ago, he had been a shell of a man, empty and purposeless, drowning in grief. He had sealed away his heart just as he had sealed away the photographs of his family. Now, watching his daughter help another lost child begin her journey, Carlos couldn't imagine his life without this purpose. The pain that had once defined him had transformed into something beautiful, a mission to heal others carrying the same wounds. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its deep resonance echoing through the quiet house. Carlos sat cross-legged on the plush carpet before the fireplace, the dancing flames casting warm shadows across his face. Beside him, an old wooden box lay open, its contents spread carefully around him like precious artifacts from an archaeological dig. His fingers traced the edge of the DNA results letter, the paper that had changed everything. Next to it lay Amelia's first drawing in his home, the stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun. Photos from before the accident were there too, preserved like treasures, alongside newer ones from their reunited life. Carlos picked up a small hospital bracelet, so tiny it barely fit around his thumb now. He remembered when it had circled Amelia's newborn wrist. "Dad?" He looked up to find Amelia standing in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep. She wore the matching blue pajamas he had bought them both last week, his with anchors, hers with little sailboats. The sight of her made his heart swell. "Hey, sweetheart, did I wake you?" Carlos asked, his voice soft in the midnight quiet. Amelia shook her head and padded across the carpet to join him. "I had a dream about us," she said, settling beside him. "We were sailing." Carlos smiled. "Was it a good dream?" "The best," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. Her eyes fell on the spread of memories around them. "What are you doing?" "Just remembering," Carlos said. "Sometimes I still can't believe you're really here." Amelia picked up a photo of herself as a toddler, sitting on Carlos's shoulders at a fair. "I wish I remembered more from before." "We'll make new memories," Carlos promised, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Every day." The fire crackled and popped as they sat together in comfortable silence, examining the pieces of their shared history. Amelia reached for the DNA letter, her eyes scanning the scientific language that had confirmed what Carlos's heart had already known. "Can we stay like this forever?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but steady. Carlos felt his throat tighten with emotion. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I lost 5 years of you," he whispered. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for it." Emilia wiggled out of his embrace and reached behind her, pulling something from the pocket of her pajama pants. "I made you something," she said, suddenly shy. She placed a handmade card in his hands. The front showed a drawing of Carlos with a birthday cake, surrounded by colorful balloons. Inside, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Happy birthday to my dad." Carlos looked at her, confused. "It's not my birthday, sweetheart." "I know," Emilia said, her eyes serious. "I don't know your actual birthday, but today feels like the day you were born as my dad." She pointed to the DNA letter among the memorabilia. "That's when you really became my dad again." Carlos stared at the card, unable to speak. The simple truth of her words struck him deeply. Though he had been her father since birth, their reunion had indeed been a kind of rebirth for both of them. "Do you like it?" Emilia asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. Carlos pulled her into a tight hug, his eyes wet with tears. "It's perfect," he whispered. "The best birthday I've ever had." The morning dawned clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through the windows of the Amelia Hart Foundation's new building. Outside, a red ribbon stretched across the entrance, waiting to be cut. Dozens of people gathered on the freshly laid lawn. Families with children, reporters with cameras, city officials in formal attire. Carlos adjusted Emilia's dress collar, his hands trembling slightly. "Nervous?" he asked. Emilia shook her head, her eyes bright with determination. "Not anymore," she said, fingering the double heart pendant around her neck. The crowd hushed as they stepped onto the small platform. Carlos approached the microphone first, his voice steady and clear. "5 years ago, I lost everything that mattered. My daughter was taken from me by a cruel accident. Or so I thought." He looked down at Emilia, who stood beside him, small but strong. "Today, we celebrate not just a reunion, but a mission." He stepped back and Emilia moved forward. The microphone had to be lowered for her. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some hopeful, some bearing the unmistakable marks of loss that she recognized all too well. "Hi," she began, her voice small but growing stronger with each word. "My name is Emilia Rivera. For 5 years, I didn't know who I was. I thought I was just Clara, a girl nobody wanted." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the reporters stopped scribbling notes. "I thought I was lost," Emilia continued, "but I wasn't forgotten. And now, no one else should be either." Her simple words hung in the air. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. A mother in the front row clutched her child closer. Carlos stepped forward again, placing a gentle hand on Emilia's shoulder. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, before addressing the crowd again. "When I found my daughter, I found my purpose. And today, I want to make that purpose official." He took a deep breath. "I am announcing that I will be donating 80% of my company's wealth to the Amelia Hart Foundation, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed rapidly. The mayor, standing nearby, nearly dropped his prepared speech. A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Rivera, that's over $3 billion. Why would you give away so much of your fortune?" Carlos looked down at Emilia, who beamed up at him. He smiled, not the tight, practiced smile of a businessman, but the genuine smile of a father. "Because no amount of money ever gave me what I found in one necklace and one little girl." The crowd erupted in applause. Emilia reached for Carlos's hand, squeezing it tight as they stood together, facing their future and the families they would help. Father and daughter, once lost, now found, and forever changed. Days turned into weeks, and the Rivera mansion transformed from a mausoleum of memories into a home bursting with life. Laughter echoed through hallways that had known only silence for years. The dining room, once used only by Carlos for solitary meals, now hosted nightly dinners where Emilia chatted excitedly about her day, while Elena served steaming dishes with a permanent smile on her face. Every evening, Carlos read bedtime stories to Emilia in a voice that grew more animated with each passing night. Sometimes, when the story ended, they'd talk about her returning memories, small fragments that floated back like autumn leaves on a gentle breeze. "I remember Mom singing to me," Emilia said one night, nestled under her covers. Her voice was like warm honey. Carlos nodded, his eyes glistening. Yes, exactly like honey. At the Emilia Hart Foundation, life bloomed just as richly. The center became a beacon in the community, its walls covered with colorful murals and children's artwork. Twice a week, Emilia taught art classes to kids who reminded her of herself, lost, uncertain, but hopeful. "Today we're painting what home feels like," she told a circle of children seated at small tables. "Not what it looks like, but what it feels like inside your heart." Carlos spent his mornings in his office at the foundation, reading letters from families who had been reunited through their work. Each story touched him deeply, and he kept a bulletin board where he pinned photos of smiling families, his reminder of why every effort mattered. Elena, who had once only cooked for one lonely man, now prepared feasts for volunteer events. Her kitchen at the foundation became the heart of their operations, where the smell of her famous empanadas drew people together around large wooden tables. "Eat, eat," she would insist, pushing plates toward shy volunteers. "You cannot help others on an empty stomach." One Tuesday afternoon, Paul Dyer appeared at the foundation's door. The old fisherman shuffled in quietly, carrying a box of hand-carved wooden boats. "For the children," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Thought they might like 'em." Carlos welcomed him warmly, and soon Paul became a regular visitor, teaching the children how to carve simple toys from driftwood. As summer turned to fall, Emilia decided it was time for another tree. At dusk, she and Carlos stood in the garden beside the memorial tree that had once been Carlos's only connection to his daughter. Emilia carefully placed a sapling in the freshly dug hole, her small hands patting the soil around it with reverence. "This one's for the lost kids we'll help find," she explained, looking up at her father. Carlos knelt beside her, his hand joining hers in the soil. "Two hearts, one promise," he whispered. Cherry blossom petals drifted down between them, catching the golden light of sunset as they fell. Father and daughter remained there, silhouetted against the twilight, two hearts finally beating in unison. If you enjoyed the story of Carlos and Clara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.